will start us off here. It's 9 o'clock. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ann Mavity. I am the Executive Director of Minnesota Housing Partnership, and I am just delighted that all of you have joined us this morning. As you probably know, in addition to the direct technical assistance that Minnesota Housing Partnership provides to rural communities and Native nations in Minnesota and around the country to identify and create housing solutions, MHP also provides research and leads statewide advocacy to advance affordable housing. So today's topic is zoning. But really, this whole discussion is about the tools that communities use to advance or to prevent the development of affordable housing, as well as looking at some solutions to this challenge. So we have a lineup of experts on this issue, which we've divided into two panels. So the first half of the program is going to feature MaryJo Webster, who is a Star Tribune journalist who co-wrote How the Twin Cities Housing Rules Keep the Metro Segregated. And we'll also have Asad Aliweyd, who is the Executive Director of the New American Development Center, and he's been a leading advocate in affordable housing in his hometown of Eden Prairie and in the Twin Cities suburbs generally. So the second half of the discussion will look at policy solutions that the state legislature is considering. And we are honored to be joined by Senator Rich Draheim, chair of the Senate Housing Committee and chief author of several zoning reform bills. And then also by Representative Steve Elkins, who is the chief author of the Comprehensive Affordable Housing Act, which also directly targets local zoning tools. So as a reminder, if everyone could keep their mute buttons on during this program, but also put your names in because that's helpful for everyone to see, and feel free to keep your cameras on. It's always fun for the panelists to see some of the reactions going on. So on our first panel, you know, it's really about local governments exert the most direct control over land use and housing production, and zoning is the primary way in which cities manage and regulate the land use. And so local officials can use zoning to either encourage or even mandate the types of housing that they want to see more of. And of course, they can use zoning to prohibit or restrict the types of development and housing that they want to see less of. So exclusionary zoning that we are seeing by affluent and largely suburban communities restricts housing choice for lower income families. And it exacerbates these racial and economic segregation that we've seen that are rooted in discriminatory housing policies that were established by the federal government decades ago and now are being perpetuated at the local level. And it's resulted in worst in the nation housing and home ownership disparities and segregation for which the Twin Cities and Minnesota is unfortunately known. So let's learn more about it. MHP's Director of Policy, Libby Murphy, will moderate these panel discussions. Libby? Oh, and you are on mute, Libby.
Yep. Sorry. I was trying to get our slideshow up. I'm having a glitch, but so thank you all again. I'm going to turn it immediately over to MaryJo Webster from the Star Tribune to talk more about her reporting from this summer. So MaryJo, welcome. Excited to have you.
Thank you for having me here. Can I share my screen?
You can.
Okay. I'm so thrilled to be here talking about this. I'm going to talk today about this project that I co-wrote this summer about how zoning is perpetuating racial segregation in the Twin Cities. I want to make sure all of you are aware that I'm here merely to inform this conversation. That's my job as a journalist, and not to support any particular policy proposals. But I've spent a lot of time on this story, and I feel like I've learned so much about this topic, and I would like to share that with all of you. I'll get a little backstory here for you first, why we started this story. Back in late 2018, when Minneapolis eliminated their single family zoning, we were hearing that the city of Minneapolis was 70% of its residential land was zoned for only single family detached homes. And experts were telling us that that change would not yield much effect because housing is a regional issue. And it made us wonder, well, okay, if Minneapolis is 70%, what's the region as a whole? And so we set out to try to answer that question first. And this required going to more than 100 municipalities that are at least partially located within the Metropolitan Urban Service Area, the MUSA, and asking them for their zoning maps in GIS format. This was not as hard as I thought it was going to be. So many communities were very helpful, and I was very grateful for that. But the hard part comes that cities, they often use the same codes like R1 or M1, but those codes don't always mean the same thing truly in what it means on the ground and what can be built there and what can't. So I spent probably the better part of 3 months poring through zoning ordinances to determine what those truly mean and what was permitted by right in each of the zoning, thousands and thousands of zoning districts in these 100 communities that we looked at. And we turned that into a database where we could measure. And each of the residential zoning districts we chose to put into buckets based on the most dense form of housing allowed by right, no special permissions required, in that district. And we came up with 3 buckets that make up these maps that you see with my scrolly thing here. The main one being areas that only allow the single family detached homes. And that is roughly 73% of the residential land in this region that we looked at. Now I say roughly. This is a little squishy number because of a couple things. One is that there's a lot of cities, particularly out in the outer edge of the metro, that are using planned unit development, planned unit developments, and often in their zoning maps, areas were set aside as PUD, and it would have been a huge lift for us to try to figure out, well, what is actually going to be allowed in that area, and so we had to set those aside really and eliminate them from this analysis because we don't know what's there. It's kind of this big black box. So the 73% might be higher, might be lower, depending on what's going on in those PUD areas. It's very hard to tell. Then we also identified what is often referred to as middle housing. So this we chose to define it as townhomes or anything similar to that, like row homes, duplexes, triplexes, and mobile homes. There were a few places where it would be like they allow a building up to 4 units, a fourplex, and that would fall in here as well. You can see that's where Minneapolis falls since they changed their zoning as a result of that. And then multifamily zoning, which is really apartment buildings, 4 units or larger, and that accounts for about 7% of the land. I'll go back to the single family zoning a little bit. In the cities kind of range from maybe as low as 50% of the city, but most of the suburbs are in the 60% or higher range, some at 100%. Minneapolis, Osseo, and Spring Park are the only cities that don't have any land zoned for single family. St. Louis Park, which I mentioned in my story, is moving in that direction. I'm not sure if they've actually achieved that yet. I haven't stayed up to speed on that. Bloomington allows duplexes or denser housing in a majority of its residential areas, and you can see that here in the map. Once we had all of this compiled, then we wanted to ask that next question: is there a relationship to racial segregation? Because this was a topic that had come up in the Minneapolis discussion as well. It turns out that there is not a lot of quantitative research on this topic anywhere in the country. It's discussed a lot, but we did not have other research that was readily available that we could rely on. So we partnered up with Salim Firth, who's my story, reset. I'll stop the share. We partnered up with Salim Firth, who is the Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And he helped us with a regression analysis that allowed us to take that zoning and layer it with census data on race to see if there is a relationship between zoning and segregation. And there is. Basically, it comes down to any kind of zoning other than single family detached zoning, it leads to an increase in diversity in those neighborhoods. But even just looking at census data, you can see that people of color, but especially Black and Latinos, are very disproportionately living in the multifamily zoning districts, and very small share of white people live in those zoning districts. A key thing to understand is that what we discovered is that most of this is tied up in history. It really goes back a long ways, and to racial covenants and redlining, racial covenants, especially in the suburbs. You could see, if you take data from the Mapping Prejudice Project, you could see that the suburbs, and right now we can only see Hennepin County. Mapping Prejudice is hopefully releasing Ramsey County soon, but in Hennepin County, we could see that those suburbs that were heavily blanketed by racial covenants are still primarily single family zoning and much more white than their other inner suburb peers. And the places that have a lot of diversity in the suburbs tended to be ones that were developed after those covenants were deemed illegal in 1949. There's like this clear kind of connection there. But there's a lot of other things that seem to factor into this. And yes, my story is very focused on zoning because we have to do that in journalism. Otherwise, we end up with these big, crazy stories that get out of hand. But this is such a complex topic. And Senator Draheim and I think Representative Nash and Representative Elkins have all talked about this as well, that it is a super complex topic that is not, zoning is not the only thing at play here, but it is something that at least we at the Star Tribune had not looked at before, and we felt it was really important to take a hard look at that and inform our readers about what was going on, particularly in light of the conversation in Minneapolis. So I think that's my sum up. I know there's some questions, so I will open it up to that. Libby, I think, had a couple she wanted to throw at me.
Yeah, and I think you touched on many of these, but so one of the questions that I had for you as we had talked in preparation for this conversation was, so are there other common zoning ordinances that affect the size of properties and housing units, which then ultimately affect the cost or the housing stock that is built in a community? So not just whether something is zoned for single family, but some of those other issues.
So that is talked about a lot in the academic circles. There's a lot of economists and others who have been researching this topic, and that's one of the things they bring up a lot. And I can tell you from reading over 100 city ordinances, those things are very much in use. And it mainly, on single family lots, it's mainly the minimum lot size and the setbacks. The two, like all these things play together to determine the size and the cost of the home. And just taking away, let's say, you have to allow any kind of housing there may not solve the problem, because what if you leave the setbacks there and then maybe you can't build because of the setbacks? Like that seems to be, I'm hearing a lot about that. The same kind of thing plays out on multifamily zoning. There is a whole host of things around multifamily. There's usually rules like units per acre, a height limitation, impervious surface limitation, a minimum parking or garage requirements, the setback requirements, open space requirements. There's like a whole slew of them that end up dictating, like if you have a 1 acre lot and you're going to put some kind of multifamily housing there, all those things come into play to determine how many units you could actually build there. And these are, we tracked, this isn't in our story, but we did track those metrics in every community to see who's using them and what those are. And they're widely used throughout the metro.
Another question I had is, so in the report itself, and you didn't get to share these, but you have some city specific maps that are very interesting that tell us what proportion of the population is BIPOC, and then also how much of the city land is zoned for multifamily. And it really differs. And can you tell us a little bit more about why we see differences between, and I'm not picking on any city, but like in Edina versus the Coon Rapids have very different percentages of their land zoned for multifamily. Can you talk a little bit why that might be?
So when we first set out on doing this, we naively thought, oh, we'll be able to kind of see the winners and the losers in the city. You can't do that. There is so many complex things at play here, and PUDs is one of them. There's several communities where it looks like they have very little single family zone land, but they have a very high share of PUD. And so, as you know, these are percentages. So think of it as a pie. And so more PUD means probably a lower percentage of single family. And that on paper, that's what it looks like. But in reality, we don't really know because of the PUD. As I mentioned earlier, there's some of the inner suburbs are a little more clear because of the racial covenants, that they are still very much single family zoning because of that. But then you're also seeing, I think we're seeing a lot of redevelopment in some of these places, and that is shifting as well. So it's really, some communities I think have stepped up and done more multifamily housing. I wish I had a better answer for this, but there is no like explanation for why, there's no good explanation why things are different from one place to another.
Okay. And so then one of the questions I had is, the piece does suggest that single family zoning in the Twin Cities contributes to the region having some of the nation's worst homeownership disparities. And you've talked about its nuance and it's complex. And I'm just curious, you talked about there's a lack of data, but do you know whether these kinds of data are available for other areas to know to what extent the Twin Cities is really unique as compared to other communities?
So while we were in the middle of doing all this, there were 3 big studies that came out in other parts of the country. Robert Elkins, a Yale economy professor, did a very, very similar study of suburbs in New Haven, Connecticut, Austin, Texas, and the Bay Area. And what he found is that Greater New Haven got almost all of the residential land is zoned for single family only housing. It's like 98% or something crazy like that. Silicon Valley was at like 90%, and then the Austin suburbs was at about 94%, I think. So higher than us, but I think it's also important to note that he only looked at the suburbs. He didn't take the core cities. Our calculation of 73% is including Minneapolis and St. Paul. So those numbers are not completely apples to apples, but they're close. And then a group called Desegregate Connecticut actually collected their zoning data for the entire state of Connecticut, which is a really impressive undertaking. And what they found is that 91% of the land in this residential land in the state is zoned for single family. Their methodology is much, much closer to ours, I think. And then there's an organization in the Bay Area called the Othering and Belonging Institute. And they have done they've done especially the racial segregation and the zoning. And they found that 82% of the residential land across 100 municipalities in the Bay Area was zoned for only single family. So we're in line. We're probably more like Austin than we are the Bay Area or New Haven.
Okay. But some of those, did you have any data on the home ownership rates in some of those communities as compared to the Twin Cities?
I don't have it in front of me. I'd have to look at that. I mean, we do know from the Urban Institute published a report this summer that they calculated all the metro areas and said our disparity between Black and white home ownership is the greatest in the nation. Now, to be clear, their analysis was based on Hennepin and Ramsey County only. They did not include the whole metro or the whole state. So it's also a little hard to measure. There's a lot of these like imperfection things around there. Like we don't have great numbers on a lot of stuff.
Well, thanks. So I have time for one more, and I just the piece this summer that came out this summer focuses on how single family zoning results in inequitable outcomes or contributes to inequitable outcomes. I've also heard you talk about that it is inefficient and unsustainable. Do you want to expand or talk a little bit about maybe some other reporting that you've thought about or you had wanted to do with this piece?
So there's kind of three prongs that are routinely discussed about single family zoning. The first is the inaffordability, which you all have talked about extensively, and then the racial segregation, and then the third is that inefficient and unsustainable, really about environment and climate. And the ideas really that are discussed are this these neighborhoods that only allow single family homes are perpetuating an automobile centric culture. And then as a result, we are just putting the dense housing back into places where there's already dense housing and already a lot of air pollution. And then so those kind of concepts, but that automobile culture, I don't know if you guys are aware, but apparently our carbon dioxide, like the number one thing that is contributing to our carbon dioxide problem really is cars. Like it's not even close to anything else. It's the cars. And I was talking with our environmental reporter and she said, that's the thing. It's the cars. So, and I live in one of those neighborhoods. We don't have sidewalks. I can't walk to anywhere because there's no sidewalks in my neighborhood. And so I see it right outside my window every day. I do want to note, if any of you haven't seen, the Met Council put out a report this summer on their land use inventory. They do this about every 5 years. And they did note in there that there was a notable improvement in efficiency of land use for single family homes. And I think this is another thing I saw, which is new subdivisions tend to have smaller lot sizes than some of our older subdivisions because that's what people want. Nobody wants to mow the lawn anymore. So they're building on smaller lots, and we are using the land a little bit more efficiently than before. It's an interesting report if you haven't seen it.
Thank you so much, MaryJo. And now I'm going to turn it over to Asad Aliweyd, the founder and executive director of the New American Development Center. Asad, thank you so much for joining us, and I will turn it right over to you.
Thank you, Libby. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Asad Aliweyd, New American Development Center executive director and founder. So, the zoning issues really has been a critical discussion among many of the affordable housing, access to housing advocates and organizations like us and MBH. If the presentation by MaryJo, the Star Tribune, they said 73% of Minnesota has been. They found 73% of the land zoning for Minnesota has been zoned by single family housing. I think that's very close to the nationwide is 75%. When I was looking for some data, nationwide 75%. So single family zoning, it has been created a way of increasing, keeping minorities out of the white neighborhoods, or also making sure that communities of color should not be, first of all, no one can, 90% of 98% of these communities of color cannot build a single house in the middle of the suburbs. Actually, that's impossible. Affordability is also a lot. So single family zoning is a clear indication of housing discrimination, and that's one thing I would like to agree with. That it uses zoning ordinance to exclude certain types of housing developments. It's something that needs to be addressed locally and nationwide, which I think we should not. We should be fighting. City of Minneapolis, they did a great job actually to eliminate that, which is good. We should also work in the suburbs, especially the southwest suburbs where we work a lot. The other thing, the inclusionary housing zoning that inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing policy that we've been advocating for the last 10 years in the suburbs actually is a policy that requires a new housing development to be affordable to low income, to moderate or working class people. That kind of policy, it requires the private developers or even non-profit developers to accommodate a certain amount of the units. Let's say they build 200 units. At least 10%, 15% of those should be affordable. But the problem with that also is there is not that many developments going on in the suburbs. Very, very small. You will see maybe one development for every few years. Even those has been developed, it is 1 or 2 bedrooms, maybe 1 3 bedrooms or few 3 bedrooms. It's not really accommodating the large size families of the immigrants and especially the Somalis and other African immigrants who have, large size families like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people in a household cannot live like 2 bedrooms. So it is a huge obstacle. So for the other thing we've been talking about, which was up zoning, this up zoning stuff, actually it is I prefer inclusionary housing policy. Up zoning, first of all, who is really benefiting from up zoning? Up zoning is favoring upper income residents. It creates, I read a lot of articles about it. It creates racial displacement. You won't see, if you look in New York or Orlando or Oakland or Los Angeles or Seattle, Washington, cities that use upzoning, it creates a huge opportunity for real estate companies to develop a higher property values that encourage real estate professionals to invest projects located in areas where they have attracting people, but not really a pipe of communities. So it is something that is not really a good policy on that. The other thing is it drives the Black and Latino residents out. It doesn't bring them in, actually, because affordability is another issue as well. So what I have seen throughout this work I was doing with this kind of policies, I have seen that most of the suburbs especially the Hennepin County southwest suburbs, the zoning policies that has been put in place has been there for years, maybe for 70, 80 years. There has not been that much change. If you try to create a small thing in the middle of those cities, you will go through a whole lot of process. For example, we've been trying to open a small after-school program in one of these suburbs. They put a zoning regulation that is a free for kids. It is not even a for-profit, but the regulation, the zoning ordinance, the reading ordinances they wrote like 80, 70 years ago. No one can even benefit. It's really obstacle even for the health and well-being and education of the families. Kids cannot even get a free touring in the middle of those cities based on the zoning ordinance they have. So we have seen a lot of zoning issues, which I think local cities and state and Met Council counties, we should all work together to really do a very authentic zoning ordinance changes in order to bring a more diversity, because Minnesota is not, or the Twin Cities is not like how we used to be 60, 40, 70 years ago. There has been a lot of change. So we should accommodate that change, and we should relax some of those old zoning ordinances.
Thank you, Asad. And what I hear you saying is, in addition to relaxing some of those old zoning ordinances, there is still some skepticism or concern that it could accelerate gentrification or just result in more luxury and denser luxury housing. So I'm hearing you say you have a preference for inclusionary housing, but is there a way to pair both zoning reform and inclusionary housing to result in more affordable housing and diverse housing stock?
Yes, absolutely. Some of these policies that in place, actually, inclusionary housing policies is not even closer to the kind of affordable housing we'll be looking for. But when we're working on a policy change, housing policy change in those cities, I think we should also work with local government entities, local planning and city councils. They should see what kind of communities they would like to see in their neighborhoods. If they want a more workforce, if they want a more diverse communities, I think affordable housing or working class housing should be part of their agenda. But right now, there is a ordinance that has been in place for a long time. People in the power are very afraid to do any change. And to have a change in zoning change, in policy change, it needs more courage and visionary and initiatives of making change. That's what is missing really in those areas.
So on that, you've worked with a number of Southwest city councils. Do you think that state policy is needed that state legislators are needing to step in and have the vision, move this forward? Or do you think that some of these city councils can be motivated to make these changes on their own? We have two state lawmakers talking about the work that they're doing at the state level. So I'm just curious if you think that is what's needed.
Absolutely. I think I already said we need a state and local and county, a whole lot of efforts and organizations like MBH and us to really work together to bring a more affordable housing, inclusionary housing, a better zoning for our communities. Because when the Southwest Light Rail has been initiative started like I think 12, 11 years ago, I was one of the first community advisory council people even rejected the idea of having a train going all the way to Eden Prairie. People said this is going to bring a lot of crimes, a lot of this. We don't like our neighborhood, this to go through. We have a whole lot of city leaders, community members, residents who really don't want to change. I remember back in 2011 in a conference that we organizing, people were arguing that if light rail comes, low-income housing or affordable housing will come, more crimes and drugs will come. That kind of mentality is there. But the reality is anywhere that has a better public transportation, access to has a more jobs creation, more people will get, even housing will get, more price will go up. So state level engagement in this zoning policies, I think is a great thing. We should be doing that for maybe 10 years ago. It's too late.
So my last question that I have time for, so New American Development Center works in the Twin Cities, but also in Wilmer, Faribault, Rochester, and St. Cloud. Is this a statewide issue? Are you seeing similar challenges in those communities as the Twin Cities, or is the Twin Cities unique to what's happening in some of the greater Minnesota cities that you work in?
They are much worse than Twin Cities, much worse. So Twin Cities is even better. There's more affordable housing or working class, low income kind of housing in the Twin Cities. So, in those Wilmer, St. Cloud, Rochester, Faribault, Mankato, the communities who live there we work with in terms of housing and other programs, they really have even much more issues than we do.
Well, thank you so much, Asad. I appreciate your time with us today. And now I'm going to turn it back to Ann to introduce our second panelist.
Thank you. Thank you again, MaryJo and Asad both. As an organization that is dedicated to data-driven research and policy solutions, having this grounding, that is incredibly helpful. And Asad, the insights that you've described, that it's not just about the zoning obstacles, but it's the types of housing that are created, that they also matter. That's very helpful. Thank you. So now we are going to pivot to solutions. What are the solutions under consideration at the state legislature? In response to this growing housing affordability crisis, policymakers in many cities and states are trying to figure out how to add more housing. And certainly the economic, social, the environmental costs of poorly functioning housing markets spill over well beyond local boundaries to affect the entire regions and states, as Asad just noted. So state policymakers are investing resources and policy time at the state level to reduce the costs and efficiencies and help increase the supply of homes. And we're excited today to have two leading legislators who are deeply invested in this topic joining us. Again, Senator Draheim chairs the Senate Housing Committee, and Representative Steve Elkins has introduced specific legislation on this topic as well. And so they're going to share their state level solutions. Libby?
Thank you. And so I'm going to turn it immediately over to Representative Elkins to provide us with some comments, and then Senator Draheim, and then we'll go into a back and forth conversation with both of them. Representative Elkins.
Thank you, Libby. And I should add that, Chris, my bill hasn't actually been introduced since it was announced right after MaryJo's story appeared to take advantage of the momentum provided by that excellent reporting. And I was anticipating that we would have a special session sometime this fall where I could actually introduce it and get it out into the wild, and that hasn't happened yet. But I think the Ann and Libby have copies of the draft legislation. If anybody wants to obtain copies, they can reach out to me or reach out to them and get copies. And I also have to acknowledge that about half of the articles in my bill are actually plagiarized from individual bills that Senator Draheim has introduced in the Senate. So the two of us, along with a number of other legislators, including Jim Nash, with whom I made my very first appearance on Almanac a few months ago, are actively collaborating on legislation in this area. So I think I need to make one correction. I think that the bill is going to be titled the Comprehensive Housing Affordability Bill, not the Affordable Housing Bill, because I think it is important to make a distinction between the things that a lot of us are trying to do just to make all housing relatively more affordable and cost effective, and the twin goal of providing more housing at affordable price points for our lower income residents. So that's an important distinction to make in the kind of legislation that Rich and I are proposing. So as many of you probably know, I've been studying, or as Kurt Johnson would have said, admiring this problem for over 20 years. So I started out as a traffic commissioner and then planning commissioner in the city of Bloomington, then served on the city council in Bloomington for 9 years. And during that time, served on the Met Council's Land Use Advisory Committee. And then following that, I served on the Met Council for 8 years and served on its Economic Development and Housing Committee. So I've had the opportunity to admire this problem from both a very micro level, hands-on in local and regional government, and now at the more macro level as a legislator, and those life experiences color my approach to this topic. So I put a link in the chat to the op-ed that I wrote in the Star Tribune about close to 2 years ago now, that talked about the complexities of addressing this issue. Representative Nash likes to use the term quadratic equation to describe the complexity of this issue. I actually think that matrix algebra is more appropriate because this is a multidimensional problem. I don't think that the problem can be solved just in a kind of a piecemeal fashion. I think we do need to look at this comprehensively. The cities have pushed back, feeling that this is not a suitable topic for the legislature to weigh in on. However, I observed that Minnesota is what's called a Dillon's Rule state, which means that cities and counties only have those authorities and responsibilities that are specifically designated by the state. And zoning and planning in the state is primarily regulated under two chapters of state law, Chapter 462, which governs zoning and planning for cities statewide, and Chapter 473, sometimes known as the Metropolitan Land Planning Act, that has additional provisions in it that govern cities in the metro area, the roles and responsibilities of the Metropolitan Council, and the relationship between the Met Council and the cities and counties within the region. And those laws have not had a comprehensive update since 1994, 1995, which is when programs such as livable communities came into the Metropolitan Land Planning Act. And it was in that time frame that the principle that where there are conflicts between a city's comprehensive planning and zoning came into effect, or were effective, that the comprehensive plan would govern. And in the intervening 25 years, there have been a number of court provisions that, in my opinion, have eroded the intent of the authors of the 1994-1995 language. And I think just in general, just even within my time in the planning and zoning world, which spans about 25 years, there have been, I consider erosions in the way the planning and zoning process operates at the municipal level. The chief erosions being the widespread overuse, misuse, and abuse of the plan unit development process. So the concept of plan unit developments, which I'm not universally opposed to, but they were intended when the concept was introduced to give cities a tool that they could use to negotiate with a developer in cases where site characteristics of a particular parcel of land or a novel, new development form was being proposed for a parcel of land. So, for example, when transit-oriented development first came into vogue 10, 15 years ago, with the promoting the idea of mixed-use development, there were no municipal zoning laws almost anywhere that allowed mixed-use development, because under the longstanding, Euclidean zoning principles, all the uses had to be strictly separated. But we've evolved to a situation now where, for a variety of different reasons, almost all of the housing in the region is being built under plan unit development process. Just and in many cases, perhaps even most cases, that's a preferable option for both the developer and the city because of the flexibility that it affords. But essentially, it represents just throwing out the zoning code entirely, and with the planners and the city and the developer playing, let's make a deal. And increasingly, it's being used by newly developing suburban cities as backdoor ways to collect development impact fees and impose other kinds of aesthetic requirements that increase the house of the cost of building a home, and drag out the entitlement process, the process that the developer goes through in order to get their zoning approvals interminably, which adds risk and adds cost to the project in other ways as well. And to the point where, if you look at what actually is being built in the newly developing suburbs, it's hard to find anything that is being sold anywhere for less than $450,000. And the median price in these suburbs right now is probably $650,000. And that's not affordable to anyone right now. And almost all of this housing is being either built under a large lot single family zoning or under plan unit developments.
Representative Elkins, that was super informative, and we could probably spend an hour learning more about all of that. But I want to give Senator Draheim an opportunity to introduce himself and the work that he's done to date, and then we'll just do some questions with both of you. So Senator Draheim, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for hosting, and thanks for the discussion. As everybody probably has gathered, that housing is a complex issue, and there isn't one silver bullet that's going to fix our housing issues here in Minnesota. We do a lot of good things here in Minnesota, but there are some things that are awful. And I guess what has driven me the last 5 years is the fact that we are the bottom of the list for the homeownership gap. And as a state, Minneapolis normally is considered the worst MSA in the country, but as a state as a whole, we're still not that good. Unless you're white, then you're fantastic. You know, we have a top end age of home ownership for white people, a high home ownership rate in general. But when you slice it apart, there are issues. And I believe the goal from a state standpoint should be a pathway to home ownership. And there are a lot of different things along that path that are important, from homeless to affordable apartments, you name it. And then senior housing is something that we've tried to bring the forefront. Probably the first things we did when I got elected was trying to push the senior housing, and then probably manufactured housing is the other. Manufactured housing in some parts of the state is the first step, if you will, on that home ownership trajectory. I think most of us realize how important home ownership is. And I know I'm a broken record on this home ownership, but I think that should be the goal. And if people choose not to do that, that's great. But what can we do to help along the way? And I think a lot of things have been touched on. We have to find a balance between what we're doing now and kind of a free-for-all, if you will. I'm a property rights guy. I think that is one of our building blocks of our country, is the right to own your own property. But there are some guide rails we should have on that. But we also have to change a little bit when we look at the multi-generational needs of subsegments of our population. We need to be a little more flexible than what we are right now. So, and I'm not just talking accessory dwelling, which is a piece of that. You know, that bleeds into a duplex or a triplex, et cetera, and just zoning from the cities on that. Zoning is a huge issue that we've had a lot of discussions with the League of Cities and the Metro Cities and other groups on trying to push that. And unfortunately, our attempts to get legislation passed has been blocked. You know, just to be blunt, I'm a Republican. It did not go through the House, which is controlled by Representative Elkins' group. And not that we didn't have support. We did have support. But change is hard for a lot of people. But we have to do a better job. We have to get changes to zoning. I've had multiple cities tell me their zoning is to help keep the riffraff. Think about it. Keep the riffraff. I look at it as a pathway to home ownership. People on the pathway out of poverty. Rent control is another issue, which we don't have time for today, and I know it's not part of the discussion, but I think it is something that we have to have a longer discussion on, and I think we will this year. The cost, the density is something that we've tried to look at, and it's kind of been sidestepped with the cost of lumber and other building materials, and then the labor shortage. labor shortage we knew was coming. And we've been unable to help that, to get more people interested in the trades, which are a really good career that pay very highly. But we have to work together to do a better job on getting more people into the trades. That a plumber and electrician are always going to be needed. We're always going to have issues there. So we need to do a better job of encouraging young people to at least explore the trades a little bit more, to move forward. The manufactured homes, when we toured the process, the construction of them, that I think that is an answer. That I would say I have seen stick-built homes on site built more poorly than what's being built in the factory. The whole procedure has changed. It's very energy efficient. It's very efficient as far as time and material goes. I'm really excited to watch where the new building construction ideas come. You know, there's some social media videos of Habitat building a robotic home right now, and where that's going, you know, I don't think they could do that here in Minnesota, but you know, that's exciting to watch. And then for the multi-housing programs that the state offers, I think we have to look at the application process. And this is something we've tried to look at and change in the past. But when you see a stack of papers for that application, it's 5 or 6 inches tall of 8.5 by 11 feet of paper. We have to figure out some way to streamline that process so the people that are doing multi-housing projects for affordable housing can get through the process faster, so we can build the units fast. Yeah, go ahead.
You're doing a wonderful job of highlighting the complexities of developing more housing and more affordable housing in particular. I wanted to refocus us back on zoning. And in the beginning of your comments, you were talking about how your legislation has made it into conference committee reports in the Senate side, but has been blocked. This year feels different. Representative Elkins has this bill, and I've heard a number of lawmakers are planning to co-author that bill when that gets introduced. What is different? What is the makeup of the coalition of lawmakers who are supporting this? And are you more optimistic this session?
I am. You know, I give a big thanks to Representative Elkins for that. We've worked together on other bills in the past, and there are quite a few people across the aisle that agree. We just haven't had enough of them to get it through to the finish line. You know, part of my journey on housing is pretty much to get people to pay attention. I wore down my Senate colleagues, and now I'm trying to work on the House. You know, to have, you know, we passed that bill to do a commission, and for those that don't know, the commissions are both the House and the Senate working together. And I think that helps to have that dialogue so more people understand the complexity of the issues. Zoning, I think, is one of the first things we should attack. And I think there's a lot of support there between the House and the Senate to work on that.
Representative Elkins, you want to answer?
So I think one of the things that's helped, you know, since MaryJo's story appeared is that, you know, I think her story was a real eye opener for members of my caucus in terms of exposing the ways that these zoning practices are used to reinforce segregation. And we have, you know, younger legislators that, you know, in my cohort, the cohort before I was first elected in 2018, who have experience in local government. Mike Howard is the vice chair of the House Housing Committee, for example. He was a city council member in Richfield. So there are more of us now that have taken an interest in this as a topic in our local government careers as well, have an appreciation for these issues. So that and just MaryJo's story was very effective in terms of elevating the use of exclusionary zoning to further segregated housing patterns. And I think that's helped a lot in terms of winning over people on my side of the aisle.
Another question I wanted to ask both of you, and I see there's Tim Thompson made a comment that maybe is connected to this question, but so what I've heard this, what you both introduced or are planning to introduce described as a mandate from from state government. As you were working on these proposals, did you consider alternatives like financial carrots or sticks tied to quantitative housing production targets, or allowing developers to override local zoning under certain conditions? Was any of that under consideration, and why do you feel that what you've introduced or planning to introduce is the best route?
Well, yes, we have discussed and had bills that would, if you will. There was even discussion to say that communities that didn't follow XYZ couldn't qualify for any government funding for housing or for leasing projects. You know, I've tried to work with the cities, try to find some compromise. But I think that'll probably be the last thing we do, is say that either you have, and we have bills that suggested some of these things for zoning, but we need to get the cities on board on the common goal. And I think a lot of them are, when you sit down and talk to them on a one-on-one basis, they get it. I've probably talked to 30, 40 cities across the state. And when I sit down and explain what we're doing, they agree with the goal. Now, are there some one-offs that need to be changed? Yes, definitely, for zoning. Historical cities. So one of the things that we wanted to do was close that loophole for planning unit developments and the appearance of the home, the facade of the home. And you know, a lot of communities want the white picket fence, the 3-car garage, some kind of stone or brick on the front of the home. And that really shouldn't be part of the zoning process. Now, if the property owner wants that, I'm all for it. Wonderful looking home. But when we're talking affordability, where does that start and where does that end? And I think most important, people can always upgrade. And that's why I had a bill to stop the construction code. We have the most strict construction codes in the country. We build very safe, very energy efficient homes. And every year we keep on adding to them, which adds to the cost. I wanted a timeout for that because they add cost. So for every $1,000 that we add to the cost of a home, we eliminate 3,000 or 4,000 people from affording that home. So we have to find that balance.
Well, I want to ask.
We do have a carrot program at the Twin Cities, the Livable Communities Program, which is a grant program administered by the Met Council that was established by the legislature back in that 1994 or 95 time period. This grant program is only open to cities that agree to guide sufficient amount of land in their comprehensive plans to accommodate additional their fair share of multifamily housing. And the problem with that programming now is that there, quite frankly, are cities within the Twin Cities that are gaming that program by guiding sufficient land in their comprehensive plans to qualify for the livable communities grants, but then they don't follow through and rezone the land. And so a developer will spend a year working with city staff developing a multifamily housing project on land that is guided for multifamily housing. And then the city council will deny the rezoning when it comes up for zoning approval at the city council meeting. And that's one of the practices that I'm trying to stamp out with the provision in my bill.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. I feel like we could have a follow-up webinar. There's so much that was touched upon that we don't have time to follow up further on, but I want to turn it back to Anne to wrap us up. Thank you so much.
Well, again, thank you, both Representative Elkins and Senator Draheim. It's going to be an interesting session ahead, and we're looking forward to it. For all of you still on, please go to our website to sign up for MHP Connect to stay up to date on these kinds of opportunities and conversations and other information about state and federal housing policy. I think their connection to that is in the chat right now. And then also just wanted to mark your calendars. MHP provides additional programming through our Investors Council programs. And our next Investor Council program is going to kick off the state's 2022 legislative session on January 27th at 8 a.m. The legislative panel is going to include Commissioner Jennifer Ho, House Ways and Means Chair Rena Moran, Senate Majority Leader Jeremy Miller, and Senate Minority Leader Melissa Franzen. And it could be more. It's going to be really exciting. So email investorscouncil@mhponline.org. Again, I think that's in the chat for more information and how your organization can support MHP in this important work of advancing affordable housing. So thank you, everyone. And thank you for all you're doing to advance affordable housing. Hope you make this a great day.